All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Brandon. I didn't get to introduce myself earlier. I'm Brandon Hayes. I work at the front side. I've been there a while. I've been doing Ember for a while. Are you all ready to give fixtures what for? It's gonna be fun. First off, thanks, Chris. Ember add-ons are really tough. They're tough to get into and tough to build, and and this is actually, but it's a great set of tooling for sharing code with people. Like I commend add-on authors because it's a lot of work to do, and but with a good set of tools, you can do some really cool stuff. And we're not going to talk about the add-on ecosystem or the process of building an add-on, but this is what happens when you set tooling up that's that good, is you get to do fun stuff like this. Ostensibly, this is a talk about testing, but really I want to talk about why Ember CLI Mirage is one of my favorite things to have happened to front-end dev in the last year. In order to do that, we have to go back in time a little bit. May I see a show of hands of people who were doing Ember in 2013 through like mid-2014? OK. What was the testing story? Was it rad? Or rad? On the scale of rad to radtacular? Yes. What are you talking about, Yakshave? So let's just get a test setup going. I'll just choose a test runner and a test framework, add an assertion library. Why, they're sure to work together fabulously. This pretty much sums up my experience with testing in early Ember days. And then after many, many, many iterations, you might actually get something that actually gets off the ground. A lot of people didn't, and they just gave up. Some people called us, and we helped them get set up. Like literally a part-time job for the front side during that time period was helping bootstrap people's test setups. They were like, please, we will pay you. Just get my test setup going, and then we can move on with our lives. It was very painful. And then, right, Ember CLI shows up. That's good times. Happy days are here. Testing, at least in Ember, it's not the result of some like bespoke set of plugins anymore. It's just a thing that you do with great tooling and lots of community support. But what about getting data into the app? Well, back then we started with, it came with IC Ajax, if you remember. That came from Instructure. Ryan Florence was, I believe, at least partially or mostly responsible for that. And it was fine for what it did. It was kind of the most naive way to approach it of we're going to stub out Ajax, which Ember uses to get all the data into the app. But it was possible. You could get data. And then along came Pretender. Trek Lewacki created Pretender. It's a fabulous piece of software. It's, in fact, I would say nearly perfect. There's not a lot to add to it. It took the ability to stub out your Ajax requests and married it to Route Recognizer, which you can make this nice little mock server in your app. And man, that feels great to use. For a lot of people, it's all you're going to need. You get this lovely little API for building a fake server, a simple interface so that you can take your static fixture data and serve it up. And your tests just worked fantastically. And then you're like, oh, well, what kind of data do I use? Well, we'll set up some static fixtures. It'll be fine. We'll have a little fixture and maybe add another one, and another fixture here and there. And now you're breaking up this multi-thousand line monstrosity, and you want to add like one field. On the server side, somebody says, hey, oh, by the way, we just added a field to this thing on your server, and you're like, no! You have to give me like 2 weeks notice before you do that. And you just need to update it in like 200 places in 10 different files. You knew it was unmaintainable when you wrote it, Charles. I knew it was unmaintainable when I wrote it. None of us is innocent here. But we saw this train wreck coming, but we also didn't have the tooling to do much about it. And then a year ago, like almost exactly a year ago, Sam Selikoff open sources this little thing that people are like, what is this? It's this really cool library called Ember CLI Pretenderify. And it was like an opinionated take on Pretender. And it was pretty rough around the edges. In fact, it would just ship all of your fixtures to your factories and stuff to production, which may not be great. But it showed a lot of promise. And the promise is, what if you could have lots of data to play with in your tests without these crystalline fixture structures. And then the project grows more ambitious, changes its name, and Mirage now relies on factories to create all this data. You can build factories to dynamically generate data rather than use fixtures, which are like these things that are just frozen in carbonite. And then 010 came out, and this really cool thing happened where you could actually use it for free now in development mode. So all this work you do to set up your test stuff is available for you to use in development. And we'll come back to this, but it made building UIs like really fun for me again, when testing was starting to feel like a chore. So you may already be familiar with Ember CLI Mirage. How many people in here are currently using it? That's like a solid majority of the room. How many people are using the latest beta version of it? OK, so we have a few people on the latest beta. So some of this stuff may be review, but even though I was using it, maybe not in depth, understanding the kind of digging into the code and putting this talk together helped me understand some of the reasoning behind the major changes that are happening under the hood. But first, let's just start with a basic primer on what Ember CLI Mirage does. So it's comprised of a few small pieces. One of them is the mock server. That mock server just comes for Pretender. So if you've used Pretender before, you've used the foundational bits of Ember CLI Mirage. It's a mock server. If you're Python, it looks like Flask. If you're Ruby, it looks like Sinatra. If you're JS, it looks like Node. It's just a really simple little mock server with a couple of key improvements. So back in Pretender days, you could define a lot of similar endpoints. That's not really that different from what Ember CLI Mirage does now, but it cleans up what you have to return a bit compared to Pretender. So you don't have to like return the entire response, including the status code and all that stuff. But the biggest change happens in these two letters here. See that little DB right there? That injects a little data store to help you look up data. So it's just a big object that has a bunch of stuff in it. But where does that data come from? Well, that comes from factories. So these factories have absolutely zero to do with the data in your actual Ember app. They're data that from some pretend server, you could throw garbage data at your Ember app. And if your Ember app was set up to handle it, it would handle it. It's just the data that you want to pretend that your server is going to send. I don't want to have to show you that fixture data again. So let's just see how we do this in Mirage. So factories do what they say on the tin. It's a factory that stamps out a plain old JavaScript object that will be used to build your fake server payload. So you want to pretend like I have a server, it's sending me some stuff. I want to generate that somehow. This is going to generate it. But check out this rad Faker integration. It's a lot of fun to use Faker. And then to use it in your tests, it's pretty easy. You create one or a bunch of them, and you can customize the attributes you use to create them. You can put a route handler in your test like you would with Pretender. It's all pretty flexible. But unlike Pretender, it's running against a little mini database on the back end, on its fake back end. So updating a record can actually do the right thing instead of having to set up another pretend response per interaction. So if you do like a put or something like that, you can actually update the response under the covers. It's pretty awesome for acceptance testing. And then it's got this cool little thing called shorthands, which is, hey, we have all these strong conventions pulled together. We can make setting this up pretty painless. So with a standardized way to fetch all that data from fixtures and factories, you can have this tighter, more declarative style of setting up your mock server. So this get groups is like, well, I'm going to the groups endpoint. It's probably a safe bet that I'm going to go to the groups object and fetch all the groups. Put is going to update the object at this ID. This is normally like a whole ball of code to deal with in your Pretender app, and here it's convention over configuration for the win. And then with these tools, a fake database, stubbed out AJAX handling, a fake server, you have all the ingredients for actually a decent dev server with no external dependencies. So it's sort of a side benefit of this, but you can work in dev mode with Ember CLI Mirage as well as testing. Also, a hint, it is actually not a side benefit. I think it might be a huge part of the point. So using it is basically just running a few factories in dev mode in this scenarios JS. So scenarios x.js, and this in default is the one that runs by default. So you can start your app with different sets of data in all these different scenarios if you want. And then you can just opt out of development mode in your Ember CLI config if you want. It's just a line of code. So awesome. This is great, right? We can do all this stuff without writing or maintaining any fixtures. We can get back to clacking away at our retro handmade hipster keyboards with Cherry MX switches and finish building our Atreus or whatever. Except it's not really all the way there. I don't know many 0.10 pieces of software that are like, great, ship it, we're ready to rock. Relationships aren't really that well represented yet. It's also kind of a pain to set up JSON API support. This is the #1 question I've been getting from some people when I said, hey, what do you want to know about Ember CLI Mirage? Is like, how do we do JSON API? So this is part of why we don't want to do these fixtures. Like setting up a fixture to play nicely with JSON API is like drill a hole in your head horrible. And now we have a thing. It's called Ember CLI Mirage 0.20, and it's a big jump in some ways. The bad news is that the programming model for using this changes a lot. And if you're in the Ember community, you're used to that, so it's fine. And it's actually not simpler to wrap your it's not actually simpler to wrap your head around at first, especially if you've used this before and you're like, why can't I just get it out of this DB object? And you can, it's just a little slightly more verbose. You have to add like one more dot in there to get stuff. And I'll show you what I mean by that. But these things are actually really helpful. The good news is if you do upgrade, the docs are extremely good. The error messages are spectacularly helpful. Like, imagine a world where your error message says, copy this code and run this generator, and it will fix the problem that you're experiencing. That's the quality of error message that we're talking about in Ember CLI Mirage. It is a feat of programmer user experience. The docs are even versioned and kept up to date. This stuff, like the user experience geek in me as a developer, that makes me deliriously happy to see. So one new change is that in addition to a factory, you also have to generate a model per model type. This is just internal from Mirage. It has nothing to do with your models in Ember or Ember Data. In the future, now it's on the table that it may read your Ember Data models and be like, oh, I know exactly what to do with that. I'll just generate that stuff for you. But you basically have to duplicate that model stuff because you're representing the server on one side. It's completely separate. Just you have to remember, I'm in server land right now. I am not in Ember land. So models are primarily for defining relationships to other models. There's not a lot of work to do here, but a model does need to exist for each factory now. It's nice because there's a layer above it, and I'll explain what that means in a second. So serializers are able to take this model data. So now that it's not just operating on this plain JavaScript structure, it can take all this fake model data and these models and these defined relationships, and it can automatically format all that JSON for that server response. So serializers are pretty cool. They have the ability to do cool stuff, like make sure that a relationship gets embedded or sideloaded with this helper. So you can do include, you can do embed, I think, is another helper. There's a list of helpers on their site. And they also have one other neat superpower. You can get active model serializers or JSON API support right out of the box for free. So all that configuration that you've done in the past to format your responses for JSON API, the promise of JSON API is not having to do that stuff. That's for library authors. Guess what? Ember Data is a library. Ember CLI Mirage is a library. The stuff that you'll use on your server is a library. You should not have to configure that stuff to play nicely with each other. And now you don't. So it's basically zero code. Just use the JSON API serializer, and you're off to the races. You just need to make sure to continue to use hyphenated keys in your factories to conform with JSON API spec, and you should be pretty good from that point. So there's not really much to show there. I was like, oh yeah, let's dig into this JSON API stuff, and it was a little anticlimactic because I was like, that's it, okay.
For the serializers, if you define an application serializer,
yes, that's. Well, you are. So if we go back, you'll see I have to extend.
But as long as you.
So here we're importing and then extending application serializer for our.
You have to do that if you are actually doing
if you're going to do something like relationships, I have a few models. This is the only custom serializer I have so that I can sideload things. So custom serializers, you can have one. It's just like Ember in Ember Data, where if you define a top-level serializer, everything will by default inherit from it. Yes. But if you are going to extend it, you have to extend the application serializer. So the API for customizing your own serializer is pretty slick. If you do need to do that, it's really well documented. The new thing 3, this is going to be, it's sort of hard to explain the abstract, so we'll try to pull out a couple of examples. So it has an object relational mapper. And a lot of developers will immediately start running, like an explosion is happening behind them, run. So when I read that, I was like, oh, why does this need an ORM? It's getting data it's faking some JSON data. And basically, the purpose is to allow you to not muck around with the database so much anymore in the app. You'll be fetching and updating records through the models. It's a different paradigm, but it has a lot more convenience and flexibility to it. And it allows it to play nicely with some of these serializers. So remember this guy? So the way the API changes is pretty minimal. I mean, they've tried to make it pretty low impact for people, but the API does change here. So here, if you do enough JavaScript, you go, oh wow, I'm just like, this means I'm just fetching data off of an object. So the groups is just a blah. It's just a piece of static data that's at this point hanging off the DB object. Well, that's not super flexible, but this is, because now we're dealing with functions. So it's passing in a schema object. So you step up a level and say, I'm passing the entire schema in, which is going to have models now. Instead of this big DB object that has all of your data just kind of, internally, I'm sure, internally to the team there, that probably looked crystalline and frozen in time for dealing with. So these are now model objects, and then you call .all to get it. So this API, when we say ORM, it's like Ember Data, or if you work in Ruby on Rails, it would be like Active Record. It's a little small slice of something like that, where you can fetch a single record, all of them, update something, save something, and have it persist to the little database. So they just added a sharing layer above that. So you're not talking directly to that data anymore. You're not messing with it. You're talking to functions that reach in for you. I strongly recommend checking out the docs for this. They're really well done. So obviously, there's some changes and things to look out for with this new version. There was one particularly nasty problem where I was trying to get a many-to-many relationship working for like 2 days without unleashing Zalgo. And it took me a while to figure out that's just not possible right now. And you do not want to unleash Zalgo. Don't do it. Leave him in there. So Ember Data can do many-to-many, and currently Mirage can't. So you have to use join models, which I also couldn't quite get to work. So I have kind of a half-working implementation that works in Ember Data, it works in real life, and it mostly works in Ember CLI Mirage. That was kind of a bummer. But that's the deal, right? We're in beta 5 of a 0.2 piece of software. It has exceeded all of my expectations to this point. So introducing a model and serializer layer into your fake server makes the mental model more complex. That's not as much fun. And there's that many-to-many Zalgo thing. There's the problem, just a general problem of getting excited about beta software. It's going to break your heart, and you're going to spend some time in its source code. And so if you love source diving, jump right into beta software and use it. But it actually wasn't so bad, and they're pretty awesome. Like, I've been using the Ember testing channel to bounce this off of other people and digging in myself. You can probably find me in the Ember testing channel in the Ember Slack. So all that said, Ember CLI Mirage is one of my favorite things to happen to front-end dev in the last year. And the reason is that you have this development mode first mentality that flips the entire model of building UI on its head. We're so used to having somebody be like, bleh, here's an API, see what you can make look pretty, hammer the data pegs into the holes in your UI, and make something look nice. And this way, if you have any influence over the back end of your app, you're like, no. Here is the UI that I want. And the API that I need to exist in order for this to happen is this. It's this JSON API with these models. If you can deliver this to me, that contract becomes very easy to negotiate at that point. And it's a really amazing way to build apps, and it's a heck of a lot more fun. And I think this is sort of lending itself to this big movement that's happening in UI development right now, where people are starting to bet their business on their user experience rather than their store of data that they have on the back end that they can kind of like paint something on screen to show it on screen. The actual experience, so Slack is a great example of this. A lot of organizations are kind of waking up to the realization that their UI and their user experience is the thing that will make or break their business. And so that puts a lot of control and a lot of influence in the hands of UI developers. And it's a lot of responsibility. And so tools like Ember CLI Mirage allow you to kind of take that responsibility and use it in a really professional way, because you're test driving this stuff out at the same time that you're doing some experimentation. I really like that style of development for my personal apps. It's a lot of fun to just kind of play around. And then at some point you don't need as much of that stuff anymore because your API becomes more fleshed out. And so this just exists as to run your tests. But it made dev on the front end, which had become kind of, I don't know, kind of laborious in a lot of ways. It made it fun for me again. And so I get excited about it, and that's why I wanted to tell you all about it. I think putting fun back into software development is totally something I can get behind. That's the end. There is one last thing. First off, thanks to Jeff for organizing this month's meetup. We'll have a kind of a rotating group of people organizing these meetups from here on out. And so this is, I get to kind of step back a little bit. The community here has formed really well. Today is Ember ATX's 3rd birthday. So a lot can and does happen in 3 years. So this is 3 years ago today, not today, sorry, 3 years ago, the day of the Ember ATX meetup. This is my daughter, the day of our first meetup. How many people were here at the first meetup? I think you were there. Jeffrey, you were there. Anyway, so it was a ragtag group of people. This is my daughter now. Can you tell? Yes. So she learned to cut her hair this week when her parents' backs are turned. So that's pretty awesome. That little loaf of bread, that's so bananas how much happens in 3 years. This is the day of our first meetup. So a lot can happen in 3 years. Happy birthday. It went from being this lunatic idea where nobody had this crazy technology in production to this really great community. I'm so happy to be a part of it. Thanks to everybody who's participated and will participate in it. We stashed some birthday cake in the fridge, so we're going to bust that out. And then here's to a fantastic 2016. I will be happy to take your questions about Ember CLI Mirage if you want to, you've pretty much experienced the limits of my knowledge, but I will show you the outer boundaries. Yes?
Remember the first question I asked you at the very first meetup?
I think you and I may remember this differently. What's your version of the story? What was the first question?
I remember showing up and everybody was like, Ember's hard. And I was like, I raised my hand and I said, how long have you been doing it? How long have you been doing it? And everybody said months. And nobody really knew what the heck they were doing.
Yeah, it was.
Literally, we'd all been hacking on it for months. And I think I asked, when does the productivity begin?
So, there was something like that. So your question was your question at the first Ember meetup was everybody here has been doing this for months and they don't feel like they've hit that productivity curve yet where they're productive in this framework yet. Where does that hit? And I think the answer turns out it was just more months. X months. I don't know the answer to that. But yeah, I remember you getting up and saying, what is everybody's always talking about the Ember way, the Ember way. What's the Ember way? And my recollection of this is that I was like, I have no idea. How about you come back next month and present on the Ember way? And you did, and it was really cool. You were like bending Ember into all these like twisted pretzel-y things. So anyway, thank you for allowing some nostalgia on there. Anyway, I'm excited about the future. I think because of the philosophy of Ember, because of the add-on ecosystem, because of its dedication to shared solutions, you get to have nice things like Ember CLI Mirage. And so 2016, I look at the field of options available to me as a developer, and I want to pick the one that has tools like that to build with, things that give you that kind of construction capability, and build from that point. Well,
I was going to ask, was 3 years later, was it worth it?
You have to ask Missy Elliott. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I'm very happy with the community and the technology and the apps I've been able to build. It's been an awesome learning experience. You, Chris?
I was going to ask, if you've got an existing test suite that's not leveraging Mirage, is it appropriate to start incrementally moving that test suite across to using Mirage?
I'm trying to remember if we've done that before. Alex, do you know if we've done an incremental transition to Mirage from like Pretender?
We haven't, but I would start with, you know how Mirage imports fakers?
Uh-huh.
I would start by just doing like faker implementations
Mm.
and seeing like where your patterns are, and then you're probably able to pull it out in the Mirage fixtures a little bit easier. That's where I would start.
Yeah, and Mirage's API is eerily similar because it's built on the same thing. And so you might be able to run both at the same time, and move and change the one to just pull in schema and be like, hey, so I'm returning a pretty static object here. How about I generate a fixture for this instead and see how that goes? And you just pass in that schema object instead of nothing when it fires that thing up. And instead of your response string for Pretender being whatever it is, like 200 for your status code, and then the header's like application JSON, you just pass the actual result you want to pass. So that would be worth experimenting with. I don't know the answer to that, but I can totally see if it is possible to run them side by side, that it would totally be worth it. And if it's not possible to run them side by side, then that almost seems like a bug to me that I would want to talk to Sam about. So I think that's a really good point and a good question. Yeah.
How are errors handled? Like, do you build fixtures for those, or is there a way to just tell the fixture behave like an error now? Or
I think you will write. I haven't tried using Mirage to automatically throw an error. I've always dropped down to the next level and return an error object. But that's a good question. I haven't tried that in the beta. Maybe it's possible to.
You can return an error with Mirage. It's a thin wrapper around the Pretender error.
Okay, so it's the same way that you would do it in Pretender, where you would just redefine in that one test. You would just redefine that server response, and tell it to return an error manually. I haven't seen a switch that you flip to say no, this is bad. That'd be cool though. Maybe there's something there and I haven't seen it, but I've always just done it the old Pretender style, where you just say nope, you return an 500 and an error object. So, all right, thanks everybody.